We work together to pull the global economy back from catastrophe, to avoid the old cycles of boom and bust.
The signs of crisis began to fade away, and as fear waned, it was replaced by new interests. The world economy demanded a new global order.
直接关系到能否实现世界经济平衡有序发展。
The fifth G20 Seoul Summit was a forum for discovering a sustainable growth model for the world economy.
The concept change, a paradigm shift was being made in this consensus.
The revolutionary economic development of the 20th century did not require complex thought. However, the global economy in the 21st century is proving to be unpredictable and impossibly intricate. A single signal from one place now receives responses from the rest of the world. In New York, winter has come again to Wall Street. Wall Street still remembers the biting cold of 2 years ago. The streets of New York, which had once moved with vitality even during winter, still have not fully recovered.
It needs to be revived. It doesn't look good, you know, with the banks holding back on their money and they're not giving out any loans. So there's no way to get the people back to work.
Is right now, because the prices are low, their interest rates are low, I believe it's going to go up again. But, you know, I think we're at a point where whatever happened in the past, it kind of, you know, brought us to where we are now. So now that it's stable and the prices are where they should be, you know, maybe the market will come back in a way that, you know, houses are priced fairly and based on market value.
The warmth of economic recovery is not yet being felt by citizens.
The bank, which is 2010, when my clients go to the bank to get a mortgage, it's like going to the dentist. It's very hard. 7, 8, 07. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 24, 25, 26 transactions. 26 transactions. Right? In November 2005 or 2006, we probably did 60 or 70 or 80 sometimes.
The American financial crisis that broke out in September 2008 left in ruins the financial system that had ruled the global economy for decades.
We know we still have a lot to do in conjunction with the nations around the world to strengthen the rules governing financial markets and ensure that we never again find ourselves in the precarious situation we found ourselves in just 1 year ago.
The destruction of American financial institutions began with the weakest link.
And consequently, there was this rather unhealthy housing boom, or bubble as it has been called, with too many loans given to too risky borrowers. And then eventually this bubble, like all bubbles, eventually collapsed.
Stimulus packages were introduced in vain. The harder the economy struggled, the more it fell into recession. The world economy began declining together. The effect was huge in Europe. The Chinese stock market went into recess, and other nations saw their stocks plummet in proportion to the wealth they had enjoyed earlier. All eyes turned to the G8 summit, which had thus far led the global economy, Unfortunately, these leaders were the very culprits of the current crisis. Old strategies could not be a solution. They needed something new to come to the rescue.
As a global steering committee for economic and political matters is obsolete, and that the G20 is the appropriate forum in which many of the global issues, economic, social, development, environment, should be addressed.
President Nicolas Sarkozy of France, which was heading the European Union at the time, proposed a new economic forum including participation from emerging economies. The existing forums included the G8, which included the United States, Europe's advanced nations, Japan, Canada, and Russia, and the G20 Finance Ministers meeting, created during the 1997 Asian currency crisis. The Finance Ministers meeting was transformed into a summit meeting to birth the current G20, which would get the world through the 2008 global financial crisis. The G20's greatest weapons for battling the crisis were the strong economic structures of emerging economies, which had become sturdy through rapid economic growth.
We will shift more responsibility to emerging economies.
G7 or the G8 represent a lot of the world's economic resources. And the extension of that to the G20 really is a way of reaching out to the emerging markets and other small but either emerging or very already, like South Korea, very strong economies, and saying this is an important part of the global economy.
The G20 leaders moved quickly to overcome the economic crisis. The first three meetings in New York, London, and Pittsburgh were clear demonstrations of the G20's power as a new cooperative economic forum.
세계 경제가 대공황으로 빠져들어간 걸 막은 건데요. 그 막을 수 있던 가장 강력한 조치는 뭐였냐면은 G20 국가가 거의 한 마음이 돼서 정책 공조를 했던 거예요.
Considering that each nation has a different set of problems, the size and method of the stimulus programs varied by country.
Financial crisis would soon lead to a macroeconomic crisis. So we thought macroeconomic coordination was very important. And then G20 in fact played that role in the sense that G20 member countries put together a stimulus package. Some countries came up with 4% stimulus package, some countries came up with 5% stimulus package, and Korea came up with a 6% stimulus package. But altogether, they were extremely helpful in encouraging those economies to recover from the financial crisis as well as the economic crisis.
And I think people agreed very quickly on the common directions that they were thinking about each within their own country, and were able to get a coordinated response that included monetary easing, support for financial institutions, and very strong fiscal stimulus.
The G20 received praise from the world's major press outlets and took its place after the breakout of the American fiscal crisis as the leading network of the global economy.
The summits themselves are changing. The first summits in Washington and in London were, in a sense, about crisis management and needed to take immediate decisions with immediate effect. The ones since then, in Pittsburgh and Toronto, have been more a matter of trying to make sure we've got a framework going forward that's going to be right for global growth. So I think that does mean a rather different emphasis.
한국과 캐나다는 내년 G20 정상회의 개최를 통해 세계 경제 위기 극복과 위기 이후의 지속적인 균형 성장 방안을 모색해 나갈 것입니다.
The third G20 summit in Pittsburgh ended as a preview of the more in-depth agenda discussions to be held in Korea and Canada. The baton was passed to Canada and Korea. At the Toronto and Seoul summits, the leaders were faced with the task of creating a new model of stable and balanced growth that could bridge the despair crisis exit strategies of member nations. Everyone had high hopes for the same goal.
We provide the aspiration for many other developing countries. Not only so, Korea also has the experience of coping with financial crisis and rebounds from the financial crisis very strongly. So I think hosting G20 meeting in Korea, it provides a good role model for the world, and it will also contribute the experiences of the development and crisis management to the rest of the world.
In Seoul, the heart of Korea, preparations for the 5th G20 summit were carried out in COEX in Samsung-dong. The media center was packed with 4,200 journalists from 63 nations who were all eager to cover the 5th summit in Seoul.
Huge differences in logistics. First of all, here everything takes place in the same building, which is a huge benefit for the media. All the logistics, technicality, everything worked perfectly here.
The Seoul G20 summit attracted more journalists than any other summit. Aware of the global interest in the summit meeting, Korea made meticulous preparations to make sure the forum proceeded without any glitches. The conference hall was carefully checked and guarded to protect the participants from any possible terrorist attacks. Safety precautions were maintained late into the night to ensure complete security.
방사능 측정장비입니다. 이게 차량도 이제 방사능 싣고 혹시 이제 여기 통과할까봐 그거 잡으려고 하는 겁니다.
Korea became the first ever emerging economy to host a world summit.
我觉得这是咱们亚洲新兴经济体在国际上，怎么说呢？这个声音越来越强的一个体现。第二，为什么是选择韩国呢？我觉得韩国在新兴经济体里面，一个是比较有代表性，这是一方面啊，它比较有代表性，是一个介于发达国家和发展中国家这么一种情况。
On November 11, 2010, the leaders of the G20 nations began arriving at Incheon International Airport. "42 special aircraft landed at the airport, carrying 33 heads of state and 3,500 accompanying aides."
刚刚美国发生金融危机的时候，大家都很紧迫，这个时候大家一条心去应付这个紧急的问题。但是随着金融危机慢慢的结束，经济进入了恢复的进程之后，凝聚力相对有所下降。
In just 2 years, so much had changed.
It's unrealistic to think that countries are not going to look out for their own self-interest.
China's presence became significantly more important.
It's a two-sided problem. The rest of the world must come to terms with China. But China should also realize that they are now a very, very, very important part of the world economy.
Everyone began the Seoul summit knowing there would be contention surrounding issues like exchange rates. The leaders began arriving at the conference center. The street in front of the COEX Center was blocked to regular traffic. Limousines carrying heads of state arrived at COEX without a hitch. At their arrival, the world's major press outlets began announcing the beginning of the 5th G20 Summit. The major agenda of the G20 Seoul Summit can be summarized in 5 points. The global economy was demanding that the G20 heads of state figure out a model for sustainable growth after the crisis. The heads of state were busy until the last moments before the conference, urging cooperation from fellow participants. The G20 nations, representing 85% of the world's GDP, began with different positions on the agenda.
글로벌 에코노미와 프레임워크에 대한 이야기를 계속하겠습니다.
금융위기 이후에 어떤 강하고 지속 가능하고 균형된 성장 모델을 찾아보자. 소위 우리가 그걸 프레임워크라고 그러는데 그거를 위해서 모든 G20 나라들 거의 모두 다가 자기네가 이제 중장기에 어떻게 할 것이다 하는 그런 정책 플랜을 냈습니다.
The comprehensive framework would directly affect management of the economy in each state. The framework dictated that each nation would present an action plan of finance management for the next 3 to 4 years. That the action plans of each nation would be mutually assessed with the help of the IMF. That these analyses would become the foundation of discussions about basic policies concerning finance, currency, and industrial structure. And that finally each country would receive a policy recommendation at the Seoul Summit. Before the G20 Seoul Summit, the G20 finance ministers met in Gyeongju to discuss practical matters. Here, the leaders reached a compromise on the currency problem in order to adopt the framework. This agreement raised hopes even higher for the Seoul Summit.
환율 포함한 각종 경제 정책 수단과 그 집행 시기 선택에 관해서 이견이 있을 수가 있습니다. 그러나 프레임워크 이행을 위한 제2단계 상호평가 과정을 통해서 서로 윈윈을 할 수 있는 방법을 반드시 찾아내야 한다고.
People need to have confidence, need to see the plan, and these plans need to be made. When they get implemented will depend on the economic developments, I think, in each country, and will come at a different time. That is going to create probably continued pressures in exchange markets. That is something that will also have to be managed.
The framework required each nation to undergo significant changes. It was difficult to bring together the heads of state to agree on one particular plan. The long meeting continued as a series of recesses and reconvenings. Currency tensions between the United States and China became the most contentious issue in the framework discussions. The United States has a $15 billion trade deficit against China, which it blames regarding exchange rates. The United States became very vocal about criticizing China's exchange rate policies.
Letting currencies reflect market fundamentals, allowing your currency to move up and down depending on the role that you're playing in the international trading system.
The most urgent task for the United States, still struggling under the crisis, was to relieve the trade imbalance it had against China, the rising economic superpower. For several years, China's trade balances had maintained a surplus, and its currency had expanded. However, China knew it was absolutely dependent on trade with advanced nations and on its exchange rates for the maintenance of its economy. As a result, The trade imbalance between the United States and China continued to grow over the past decade. China's explosive economic growth was very threatening to an ailing United States economy.
Crushing out Latin American economies that can't hope to compete against Chinese production because the Chinese are able to undersell them no matter how little you pay your workers in Brazil or in Guatemala or whatever. With this exchange rate that the Chinese have set, the Chinese are always paying their workers less.
Since mid-2008, China pegged the yuan to the US dollar to keep exchange rates stable. The United States was aiming to pursue economic recovery by cutting away the advantages China had in its currency.
美国来讲呢，就是说我们的人民币的升值并不能解决美国的消费失业人口的问题因为美国的这个它的一些问题，它主要是由于自身的一些经济结构、金融本身的一些问题。那个中国人民币这种升值再多，恐怕也不能解决它的这种失业的问题。
China's stance was firm, claiming exchange rate policies could not be a fundamental solution and that hurting the Chinese economy would in turn have adverse effects on the entire world economy.
중국이 그 위안화 가치를 낮게 유지한다는 것은 결국적으로는 이제 정치적으로 가면요, 이것이 일종의 자기네 중국의 수출품에다가 보조금을 준 거다, 이런 식으로까지 얘기를 해가지고 미 의회가 미국의 환율을 조정하지 않으면은 무역 보복까지 할 수 있는 법안이 만들어져 있어요. 아직 통과는 안 됐지만 그 정도로 이제 그 환율 문제를 심각하게 보고 있지만 중국에서는 또 그렇게 보고 있지 않습니다.
随着整个世界经济的这个重组，比如说你们如果说是在任何一个市场，在欧洲市场，在美国市场，你去买产品，大部分产品是由新兴这个经济国家所生产的。那么这样的一种经济格局的变化呢，必然会引起就是说金融体系里面的格局的变化。所以就是说，现在的这样一个国际货币体系呢，已经不能胜任，不能够承担目前经济这种格局的变化。
China responded to pressure from the United States to form a more macroeconomic view. At this point, with economic paradigms shifting, China is pondering whether this may be the time to move past a dollar-centric currency system. However, the two countries were able to agree on one point.
On trade, which is the lifeblood of the global economy, we agreed, and I quote, to fight protectionism and promote trade and investment. We renewed our commitment to anti-protectionism.
보호무역주의는 절대 배격하는 자유무역을 약속을 지키자는 그러한 양대 목표를 결의를 했습니다.
The standstill rule forbids the creation of any new trade and investment barriers while maintaining current levels of trade liberalization. It was a necessary measure for reviving global trade, which had tapered off due to the global financial crisis.
Where the developing country members of this new grouping were insistent on pushing something everybody knows is needed to be done, but none of the Europeans could screw up the courage to do, which is accept smaller shares of financial power and recognize that China, that Korea, that this whole range of new developing countries now has to have a share of voting power and make a share of financial contributions commensurate with their new share of the global economy.
Korea's opposition to protectionism was a clear representation of the positions of the emerging economies within the G20. The 20 leaders essentially had the same goal. However, they each faced very different situations. The 20 nations were very clearly divided into trade surplus nations and trade deficit nations. Another country that joined the United States and China in the spotlight was Germany.
환율 문제가 나오면 미국 대 중국, 또 경상수지 문제가 나오면 미국 대 독일, 이렇게 나가고 있거든요. 근데 이것들을 잘 이제 아우러 가지고 어떤 해결 방안을 찾는 것이 이제 G20의 하나의 역할이 아니겠는가 이렇게 보고 있는 거죠.
The major agreement between the G20 nations was that trade imbalances should not result in protectionism. Under this agreement, a set of trade balance guidelines was created. Surpluses and deficits would be curbed to a certain proportion of the GDP, and this in turn would be the standard for adjusting exchange rates and alleviating severe trade imbalances.
경상수지가 한 나라가 어떻게 할 수 있는 그런 그 변수가 아니고 시장의 결과이기 때문에 그것을 가지고 또 자유변동 환율 제도를 선택하고 있는 나라에서는 환율도 시장의 결과입니다. 그래서 두 시장의 결과를 정부에서 정책을 통해서 조절한다는 것은 반시장적이다.
The nations all agreed that trade balance guidelines were necessary, but their viewpoints collided on methodology. A long discussion followed. The two-day meetings were over. All attention was focused on the declaration agreed on by the heads of all 20 nations.
결과적으로 말씀을 드리면 환율 문제도 일단은 흔히 쓰는 전쟁에서는 벗어났습니다. 재무장관 회의에서 합의된 바가 있습니다만 그때는 기준을 만들고자 한다는 원칙만 했었습니다. 언제 어느 때까지 하겠다는 약속은 없었습니다.
The G20 agreed to complete the creation of trade balance guidelines by the first half of 2011 and to report back on progress at the 6th G20 Summit to be held in France.
Between exchange rate and current account balance, there is something called structural reform. In other words, surplus countries should spend more, and deficit countries should save more. And this required structural reform. And that's what we agreed on this G20 Seoul Summit. Basically, we have to find out and come up with a consensus which is a surplus that's not sustainable, which is a deficit that's not sustainable. And for that, we have a guideline. But of course, we didn't come up with the numbers yet, but indicators will come up by the first half of next year. And it's not just one country, but all the countries down together and mutually assess each other. And objective analysis will be provided by the IMF. So that's a wonderful framework.
At the end of the heated conference, the leaders of all nations ended on a note of compromise and agreement on the necessity of the next G20 summit.
那就是关于汇率这一块儿，中国这次基本上能够实现自己的想法。美国、其他国家，虽然也反对人民币低估，希望人民币升值，但是最终在这一块，冲突不是很激烈。
If we don't try, then we can't get anywhere, and it won't be good. So I think it's more important than ever now that we try to coordinate economic policy.
Other than quelling tensions created by the currency war, the other historical compromise concerned the reformation of the structure of the IMF. The G20 agreed to give 6% of IMF control and 2 European director seats to emerging economies.
Have been chosen by yes for the reform, and now I'm going to go on building on what Rodrigo Durato did during the last years, but going further and faster to reform the institution, because the mandate of the institution hasn't changed, but the world in which the institution has to work has changed dramatically, and so we have to adapt.
이미 피츠버그 회의에서 IMF 지분 구조에 대한 변화에 합의를 했지만 그럼에도 불구하고 실천이 되지 못했습니다. 이번 한국 회의에서 이것이 시행된 것은 실질적인 지배 구조의 변화가 현실로 나타났다.
These changes in IMF control are indicative of a shift in paradigm. The emerging economies are no longer willing to accept the notion that the World Bank must be led by an American and the IMF by a European. The fifth G20 summit also saw a compromise on a global financial safety net to keep liquidity stable and prevent financial crises, which was one of the emerging economies' most pressing concerns.
또한 국제 자본 흐름의 급격한 변동성으로 인해서 각국이 과다하게 외환 보유고를 축적하는 등과 같은 신흥 경제국과 개도국의 어려움을 덜어주기 위해서 이른바 글로벌 금융 안전망 구축을 서울 G20 정상회의 주요 어제로 추구할 것입니다.
Countries that did not use dollars as currency had previously suffered from financial crises despite having no fault of their own. The safety net would make loaning processes flexible and preventive to preclude crises in emerging economies. The world economy was slowly restructuring itself to reflect the needs of emerging economies.
Maybe the subprime crisis was a trigger to accelerate this process, but it did not start the process. I think the process was a more natural process due to a longer-term development.
In the middle of the 20th century, there were 4 Asian tigers who achieved economic development: South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. This was when changes in the world economy began. China quickly followed suit. A new structure requires a new strategy. This is what is needed by the global economy.
我觉得更重要的问题呢是，如何面对现在的这个整个世界经济的非常深刻的结构性变化，去重新建立一个适应这种经济结构变化的一个新的世界经济的货币体系，这是一个大家需要面临的问题。
The fifth G20 Seoul Summit was a forum that expanded the importance of the G20 worldwide on the foundation of the emerging economy's newfound status. One of the catalysts in the conference was Korea's proposal of the Seoul Development Consensus.
More or less beyond the old G20 agenda, and that's especially development.
There are 173 nations that are not members of the G20. The goal of the Seoul Development Consensus is to promote the development of the world economy by giving aid to non-member countries suffering from poverty.
Developing countries development itself is a source of new growth, so that if you help these countries develop, it's a way of helping yourself. So that there's a philosophical change, the concept change, a paradigm shift was being made in this consensus.
The Seoul Development Consensus is founded on the belief that poor nations should not be given aid, but rather development assistance to develop them into potential markets for the future.
I believe is seen as a country that is more, as a result of its experience, has a lot more to share with some of the poorer countries of the world than Japan or Germany or the United States, which have been doing quite well for a longer period of time.
World leaders aren't the only ones who were invited to the G20 Seoul Summit. "120 CEOs from 34 nations were invited to have a summit of their own, the Business Summit, organized by Korea to blend political discussions with real application.
이 경제 정책에 대한 논의와 합의를 하는 과정에서 기업들하고의 충분한 커뮤니케이션이 되지 않으면 G20 정상회의의 합의가 현실에서 유리될 수 있다.
The Business Summit invited global corporations that move the world economy to discuss an independent agenda which would boost the effectiveness of the G20 Summit.
At the Business Summit,
종전의 국제회의에서는 주로 그 재무장관, 중앙은행 총재회의, 그리고 정부 기관의 대표들이 모여서 회의하는 세르파 회의 등으로 채워져 있었지만은 이번에는 여기에 더 나아가서 민간 기업의 정상들이 같이 모여서 회의를 하게 돼 있는 점이 특징입니다.
A total of 120 companies attended the Seoul Business Summit, representing $30 trillion in capital and 9.17 million employees. Working transnationally, these companies are responsible for a large part of the world economy. It would be no exaggeration to say that the growth of the world economy begins with these companies' decisions and actions. The Business Summit reaffirmed the need for free trade and strongly recommended relaxation of regulations to promote the growth of small and medium businesses. The companies also agreed to search for a solution to high unemployment through green growth policies. A portion of the Business Summit recommendations was included in the final G20 declaration.
그래서 이번에 우리 서울 G20이 중요했던 건 뭔가 하면 서울 G20이 G20만 가지고 하는 회의가 아니라 G20 바깥에 있는 것도 우리가 관심을 많이 갖고 있다는 걸 보여줌으로써 G20에 대한 위상을 상당히 돈독하게 해놨거든요. 이런 것이 진전되고 G20 밖에 있는 그 국가들이 그래도 G20이라는 게 상당히 글로벌 가버넌스 체제로 유익하다 하는 것이 존재해야지만 이게 발전할 수 있는 거예요.
The G20 Seoul Summit was special in that it included 5 non-member observer states to actively participate in discussing the development agenda. The G20 development agenda included diverse problems being faced by non-developed countries, moving beyond simple economics. Climate change, which threatens the survival of the global community, and the elimination of poverty were also important topics.
Food security, energy and climate change, all of them have a big impact on the international economic architecture, and any one of them could undermine economic recovery. So it's sensible we should be looking at them.
There are too many countries in the world that are underdeveloped, and that the growth needs to include the underdeveloped countries on the world. So there should be a spread in the wealth. And so this is really what development means for us. And that is why we consider it so important for us.
The 5th G20 Summit raised the prestige of the G20 as a worldwide cooperative network through its development agenda, Business Summit, and the participation of non-member nations, as well as through its bridging of emerging economies with advanced nations, and its promotion of cooperation between the public and private sectors. The G20 leaders departed in anticipation of their reunion in France next year for the 6th G20 Summit.
下一届的法国戛纳的峰会，可能的议题，据我了解，有非洲的发展，有国际金融体系的改革，或者说它的议题会趋向于更宽泛，这是一方面；另外一方面会趋向于一种特别难实现到的一个目标，比如说国际货币体系。
French President Sarkozy announced he will pursue a more aggressive agenda at next year's summit. The G20 is moving into new territory.
So I definitely think that these meetings, I wouldn't say these meetings are useless or it's difficult to achieve a consensus, but at the same time, I think we should always try. Because if we don't try, then we can't get anywhere, and it won't be good. So I think it's more important than ever now that we try to coordinate economic policy.
The world economy is one giant mobile. All nations are separate, but they are also connected. The smallest stimulus sends waves of motion through each. Distances in time and space are no hindrance to the organic structure of the world economy. That is why the G20 Summit must exist as a cooperative forum for the world economy. The world is clearly being restructured to adjust to the conditions of the 21st century. The G20 will need to answer many questions to lead that restructuring, and it is in those answers that the future potential and development of the world's economy lie.